Most ruthless Black Mafia bosses who are still active in 2025. What if I told you some of the most ruthless Black Mafia bosses are still pulling strings in 2025, from billion-dollar drug empires to bloody wars that even prison walls couldn't contain? These aren't just crime stories. They're tales of power, fear, and survival that rival anything you've seen in movies. Frank Matthews, Larry Hoover, Fat Cat Nichols, and more legends who turned entire cities into battlegrounds. But were they masterminds or monsters? Stick with us to find out. And before we dive in, smash that like button and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence. Frank Larry Matthews. In the dark chronicles of American organized crime, few names carry the same mystique as Frank Larry Matthews, better known as Black Caesar. Bo. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Matthews had become one of the most powerful drug traffickers in the country. His empire stretched over 21 states with hubs in Brooklyn, Harlem, Detroit, and even extended influence in cities like Atlanta and Los Angeles. Federal agents estimated his organization was pulling in $1 to $2 million a week, which would be the equivalent of $8,016 million per week today. Matthews's wealth allowed him to live extravagantly. He bought luxury homes, flashy cars, including a whole fleet dubbed the Mark IVs, and even a Staten Island mansion right next to mafia titans like Paul Castellano and Carlo Gambino, who resented his intrusion into their neighborhood. He draped himself in fur coats, diamond jewelry, and lived with his common-law wife Barbara Hinton while maintaining a mistress, Denise Brown. Yet in the eyes of many in Black communities, Matthews was a modern-day Robin Hood. He donated money, helped struggling families, and provided a sense of power and dignity that contrasted sharply with the systemic discrimination they faced daily. But Matthews was not just a businessman, he was also a ruthless enforcer. He became infamous for retaliating against anyone who dared to cross him. In one legendary incident, when robbed of $375,000 by an associate of the Genovese crime family, Matthews kidnapped a relative of the thief and demanded not only his money back, but also 25 kilograms of heroin as compensation. This was more than retribution. It was a bold declaration of independence that sent shockwaves through both the Italian mafia and federal law enforcement. At this point, let's pause. Do you think Matthews was a visionary rebel challenging the mafia's grip, or simply another ruthless drug lord hungry for power? The Drug Enforcement Administration would later describe him as one of the largest heroin and cocaine traffickers in U.S. history. His operations flooded eastern cities during a devastating heroin epidemic that ravaged urban communities. By 1972, he seemed untouchable. Lavish parties, countless loyalists, and a fortune few could imagine. But in June 1973, everything changed. Just days before facing trial on federal drug charges, Matthews executed one of the greatest disappearances in modern history. He reportedly withdrew $15 to $20 million from safe deposit boxes worth $130 million today, packed suitcases, and fled in a rented car with Denise Brown. He left his wife, children, and Staten Island estate behind, promising his family, "I'll see you soon." Those words would be his last. Despite one of the most extensive FBI manhunts in history, no trace of Matthews has ever been found. Rumors abound. Some believe he escaped to Africa or the Caribbean. Others whisper he was assassinated by rivals. Yet no body, no confirmed sighting, and no financial trail has ever surfaced. Today, if alive, Frank Matthews would be 81 years old. His disappearance remains one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in criminal history. What makes Frank Larry Matthews so captivating is not only the scale of his empire, but the enigma of his fate. Unlike other mob bosses who died in prison cells or were gunned down in bloody wars, Matthews simply vanished, his legacy cemented by silence. To this day, he is remembered as both a symbol of defiance and a cautionary tale about power greed and the cost of ambition. James Rosemond. In the dangerous intersection of hip-hop and organized crime, few names carry as much weight or as much controversy as James "Jimmy Henchman" Rosemond. To some, he was a savvy music executive who built bridges between artists and labels. To others, he was a ruthless trafficker and power broker who used violence to silence enemies. In reality, Rosemond lived a double life straddling two worlds until they both collapsed on him. Born in 1965 in Brooklyn to Haitian immigrants, Rosemond grew up in an environment of poverty and crime, but quickly displayed intelligence and ambition that set him apart. By the early 1990s, he was making legitimate moves in the music industry. He co-founded the influential hip-hop conference How Can I Be Down in Miami in 1991, an event that became a hub for rising stars, executives, and producers. It was here that Rosemond carved out a reputation as a connector, someone who could open doors in an industry often sealed shut to outsiders. At the same time, he was managing artists and cultivating respect within the East Coast music scene. But behind the bright lights of music, Rosemond built a darker empire. Federal prosecutors later revealed that he ran a bi-coastal drug trafficking organization, transporting up to 30 keys from Los Angeles to New York. His methods were sophisticated and creative, hiding shipments in FedEx boxes, UPS deliveries, and even inside music equipment cases. The profits were staggering, and Rosemond used them to fund his legitimate ventures, creating an empire where crime and culture fed each other. Rosemond's reputation for ruthlessness, however, did not come from drug shipments alone. His defining moment came in 2009 when he orchestrated the murder of Lowell Lodi Mac Fletcher, an associate of the rap group G-Unit. 2 years earlier, Fletcher and other G-Unit members had assaulted Rosemond's teenage son outside a Manhattan school, a humiliation Jimmy Henchman never forgot. Prosecutors argued that Rosemond arranged a murder for hire, paying a hitman with a kilogram of cocaine worth $30,000. Fletcher was lured to a Bronx alley and shot 5 times with a silenced handgun. Cold, calculated, and personal, this was no random act, but a message that Rosemond would never be disrespected. In 2011, Rosemond's empire finally collapsed. After a months-long manhunt, he was arrested by DEA agents and U.S. Marshals in New York. Charged under the Kingpin statute, he faced the full weight of federal law. In 2012, he was convicted of leading a continuing criminal enterprise. A mistrial temporarily delayed justice, but by 2017, Rosemond was found guilty of murder for hire and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. His appeal attempts have failed, leaving him to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But Rosemond's story doesn't end with legal documents and prison walls. He is also infamously linked to one of hip-hop's greatest mysteries, the 1994 shooting of Tupac Shakur Qua against all odds, suggested as of 2025, James Jimmy Henchman. Rosemond remains incarcerated, now 60 years old, serving multiple life sentences. His name still sparks debates within music and crime circles. Was he a businessman who let the streets pull him back, or a drug lord who used music as his camouflage? Either way, Rosemond's life is a chilling reminder of how ambition, greed, and vengeance can intertwine, leaving behind a legacy of power, fear, and tragedy. Darryl Whiting. In the turbulent streets of Boston during the crack cocaine epidemic of the late 1980s, one name struck both fear and a strange kind of respect: Darryl "God" Whiting. Whiting moved to Boston in the 1980s and soon founded the New York Boys, a drug-tortured Park and Columbia Poe housing projects. Unlike the chaotic, loosely connected gangs of the time, Whiting designed his network with precision. There was a clear hierarchy, lieutenants, runners, and enforcers all reporting directly back to him. Cocaine was sourced from New York, cooked into crack in Boston, and then distributed across the city's black neighborhoods. At its peak, the New York Boys were reportedly making millions of dollars annually. What set Whiting apart was his deep understanding of control, not just over product, but over people. He cultivated an image of generosity, paying rent for struggling families, covering tuition costs for young students, and hosting community events. To residents of Orchard Park, he was not only a feared drug boss, but also a provider. This duality made him harder to resist and harder to betray. Prosecutors later argued that these acts of philanthropy were a calculated strategy designed to keep the neighborhood loyal and silent, discouraging cooperation with law enforcement. Still, the darker side of Whiting's empire was impossible to ignore. Violence was the New York Boys' enforcement tool. Rival dealers were beaten, shot, or disappeared, and residents whispered his name with a mix of fear and caution. A 1992 Boston Globe article famously described Whiting as a kingpin who ruled through intimidation with locals in Orchard Park, too terrified to cross him. His lieutenants, many of them teenagers, patrolled the projects with pagers and firearms, making sure the flow of crack and cash never stopped. Pause here. Do you think Whiting's community gifts made him a misunderstood Robin Hood? Or were they just a mask for his brutality law enforcement saw through the facade? In 1991, after years of surveillance, informants, and undercover work, Whiting was indicted on multiple counts, including drug trafficking, conspiracy, and murder. During his trial, prosecutors presented testimony from insiders within the New York Boys, though some later recanted and claimed they were pressured by authorities. Despite the controversy, the evidence was enough. In 1992, Whiting was convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The fall of Darryl Whiting marked the dismantling of the New York Boys. Without his iron grip, the once structured network crumbled and Boston's drug landscape shifted. Yet Whiting's legend lingers. To this day, some older residents of Roxbury recall him as a man who brought both fear and stability. Others remember only the devastation, families broken by addiction, streets scarred by violence, and young men lost to prison or death. As of 2025, Darryl God Whiting remains incarcerated over 30 years into his life sentence. Unlike other crime bosses who maintained influence from behind bars, his empire dissolved without him leaving little more than memories and headlines. His story is a cautionary tale. Brilliance twisted by greed, generosity undermined by violence, and a community trapped between dependence and destruction. Whiting's name may not carry the global infamy of Larry Hoover or Frank Matthews, but in Boston, he was once the god. And his rise and fall remind us of the razor-thin line between power and ruin in the world of organized crime. Lorenzo Nichols. In the ruthless hierarchy of New York's underworld, few names inspire the same mix of fear and legend as Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols. Born in 1958, Nichols grew up in South Jamaica, Queens, and by the early 1980s, he had transformed himself from a petty criminal into one of the most feared drug kingpins of the crack era. His empire was vast, disciplined, and frighteningly violent, generating around $20 million annually, a fortune that rivaled the city's most notorious crime families. Nichols's headquarters was not a glamorous high-rise or luxury mansion. It was the Big Mac Deli, a modest storefront he inherited through his wife's family. From this unlikely base, he coordinated a network of over 300 workers, including close relatives like his mother and sisters. The organization was so structured that prosecutors compared it to a Fortune 500 company. Cocaine sourced through Italian mafia intermediaries was distributed across Queens housing projects and sold on the block of 150th Street. Nichols' reputation for efficiency and control earned him both profit and enemies. But what set Fat Cat apart wasn't just the money, it was the violence. Nichols used murder as a management tool. He ordered executions not only to settle business disputes, but also for personal slights. In 1985, when his ex-girlfriend and mother of his son, Myrtle Horsham, became entangled in his disputes, she was killed on his orders. That same year, after parole officer Brian Rooney dared to arrest Nichols for a violation, he was assassinated in cold blood. The hitmen were paid $5,000 and 125 grams of cocaine, a chilling example of how cheaply human life could be valued in Nichols's world. Even after being arrested in 1985, Nichols proved that prison walls could not cage his power. He continued to run operations and order hits from behind bars using loyal lieutenants and coded messages to maintain his grip. Prosecutors described him as soft-spoken but deadly, noting how he could kill him in a whisper, and corpses would soon follow. His crew included other infamous figures like Howard Pappy Mason and Kenneth Supreme McGriff, further entrenching South Jamaica as one of the deadliest battlegrounds of the crack cocaine wars. For decades, Nichols remained a central figure in the narrative of New York's drug epidemic. He symbolized the deadly intersection of profit fear and power. But eventually, the weight of justice caught up with him. Nichols was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison alongside additional state sentences. By 2022, after serving more than 34 years, he was granted parole in New York despite strong objections from prosecutors and police unions. His legal journey didn't end there. Nichols was transferred to federal custody in 2023, but a judge ruled that his earlier state time should be credited toward his federal sentence, effectively clearing it. Still, he wasn't free. Nichols had a pending 10-year sentence in Florida tied to a 2007 conviction for auto theft and title fraud. As of 2025, he remains behind bars in Florida with a projected release date in 2026. What makes Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols so unforgettable is not just the scale of his empire, but the psychological grip he held over queens. He was feared, respected, and hated in equal measure. For some, he was a cautionary tale of wasted power. For others, he was the face of a community consumed by the crack epidemic. Either way, his story remains one of the bloodiest chapters in the history of American organized crime. Larry Hoover. When people talk about the most feared and strategic black crime bosses in American history, Larry Hoover, better known as King La Inevi Gangster, disciples GD. Unlike many street leaders who ruled only a few blocks, Hoover dreamed bigger. He transformed a local clique into a nationwide criminal enterprise commanding tens of thousands of members, even while locked inside some of America's harshest prisons. Hoover's story begins in the late 1960s when he merged his gang, the Supreme Gangsters, with David Barksdale's group to form the Without. After Barksdale's death in 1974, Hoover assumed full leadership. Under his watch, the GD dropped the black and became the gangster 30,000 members. The GD operated with corporate precision. At the top was Hoover, then a circle of 7 lieutenants, each overseeing dozens of mid-level distributors, who in turn commanded hundreds of street-level dealers. Cocaine and heroin poured into Chicago's neighborhoods, generating millions of dollars each year. By some estimates, the GD under Hoover's command was making more money annually than many Fortune 500 companies. But Hoover wasn't just about money. He ruled through fear and ruthless discipline. In 1973, he ordered the murder of a 19-year-old dealer named William Pookie Young, accused of stealing from the organization. Young was shot in the head in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood, and Hoover was sentenced to 150-200 years in prison. Yet even from his cell, he didn't loosen his grip. Through coded messages, prison visits, and loyal lieutenants, Hoover continued to run operations directing everything from drug distribution to extortion rackets. By the 1990s, federal investigators realized just how dangerous Hoover still was. A 17-year undercover probe revealed that from behind bars, he was running a vast drug network, laundering money, and even influencing politics through community organizations. In 1997, Hoover was convicted on 40 federal counts, including conspiracy, drug trafficking, money laundering, and continuing to operate a criminal enterprise. His punishment was severe: 6 life sentences, ADX Florence Supermax Prison in Colorado. What makes Hoover's story unique is the paradox of his influence. On one hand, he claimed to be steering the GD toward legitimate business and community activism under the banner Growth and Development, trying to rebrand the gang as a political force. On the other hand, prosecutors insisted it was simply a cover for ongoing criminal activity. Supporters saw him as a misunderstood leader. Law enforcement saw him as one of the most dangerous men in Illinois history. In an unexpected twist, on May 28, 2025, press the still serving his original 150-200-year sentence for the 1973 murder. At 75 years old, he continues to live in confinement, his presence looming over Chicago's streets even in absence. Jeff Fort. When it comes to ruthless street leaders who blurred the line between gangster and revolutionary, few names loom as large as Jeff Fort. Abdul Malik. After converting to Islam, he transformed the Blackstone Rangers into the Black P. Stone Nation, BPSN, one of Chicago's most powerful gangs. His reign proved that criminal empires could operate with the scale of governments and, in Fort's case, even flirt with international terrorism. Fort's rise began in the late 1950s when he co-founded the Blackstone Rangers in black 3,000 members. But Fort wasn't just a street boss. He was a strategist who knew how to manipulate systems. In 1969, the U.S. government awarded his organization a $1.4 million federal grant intended for youth job training programs. Instead of reforming his community, Fort funneled the money back into his gang, strengthening its operations and influence. He eventually served 2 years in Leavenworth Federal Prison for fraud, yet even incarceration didn't diminish his authority. By the 1970s, Fort began blending crime with ideology. After converting to Islam, he adopted the name Abdul Malik Kaaba and reshaped a faction of his gang into the He. This transformation was partly spiritual, but also tactical. Prosecutors argued that by cloaking his group in religion, Fort made it harder for law enforcement to wiretap or infiltrate them. The El Rukns became notorious not only for their drug trade and violence, but also for their near-militant structure. Fort's ruthlessness was legendary. In 1981, he ordered the assassination of rival dealer Willie Dollar Bill Bibbs, who was shot 23 times in a South Side barbershop. His willingness to eliminate threats, whether business rivals or former allies, cemented his reputation as a man who ruled through fear. By the mid-1980s, Fort's ambition reached a shocking new level. Federal authorities uncovered that he had been negotiating with Libya's government under Muammar Gaddafi. Fort allegedly plotted to carry out terrorist attacks on U.S. soil in years to his growing list of sentences. Combined with earlier convictions for fraud, drug trafficking, and murder, Fort's total punishment amounted to 168, and since 1997, Jeff Fort has been housed at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States. There he remains under a no human contact order cut off from the outside world. At nearly 80 years old in 2025, his days of commanding armies on Chicago's streets are long gone. Yet his legacy continues to shape the city's gang culture, as many Black P. Stone factions still trace their lineage back to him. Jeff Fort's story is a chilling reminder of how far a gang leader's influence can reach, from street corners in Chicago to secret meetings with foreign governments. For some, he symbolized black power and resistance. For others, he was a ruthless criminal who cloaked violence in ideology. Either way, his name remains one of the most infamous in the history of American organized crime. Christopher Coke. In the bloody chronicles of Jamaica's criminal underworld, few figures have left as deep a scar or inspired such fierce loyalty as Christopher Michael Doo-Doo's Coke. Born on March in Shower Posse, this gang earned its name by showering enemies with bullets, leaving behind streets littered with bodies. When Jim Brown died under mysterious circumstances in a Jamaican prison fire in 1992, the 23-year-old Doo-Doos inherited not only his father's empire, but also the burden of ruling Tivoli Gardens, a Kingston neighborhood that would become both his fortress and his kingdom. Unlike many drug lords who rose from poverty, Coke had a dual upbringing. Thanks to illicit fortunes, he attended elite private schools while simultaneously absorbing the street codes of Tivoli Gardens. When he assumed leadership, he combined these worlds. On one hand, he expanded the Shower Posse into a transnational powerhouse, trafficking tons of cocaine and marijuana into the United States and moving firearms across the Caribbean. On the other hand, he styled himself as a benevolent Don. He gave money to the poor, funded school programs, and built businesses like Incomparable Enterprises, a construction company that won government contracts. Locals nicknamed him the President because he provided services the Jamaican state often failed to deliver. But this benevolence masked a far darker reality. Under Doo-Doos, the Shower Posse became synonymous with ruthless violence. The gang was linked to She. The turning point came in 2009 when the United States formally requested his extradition on drug and weapons charges. The Jamaican government hesitated for months, torn between international pressure and domestic fears of backlash. By May 2010, when Prime Minister Bruce Golding finally signed the extradition order, Tivoli Gardens exploded into open conflict. Residents erected barricades, armed gangs patrolled the streets, and Koch's loyalists vowed to die for their president. What followed became known as the Tivoli Incursion, one of the bloodiest episodes in modern Jamaican history. Over 73 civilians were killed as security forces stormed the neighborhood in a desperate attempt to capture Koch. Entire families were trapped in their homes while gunfire raged outside. The uprising exposed just how deeply embedded Koch's authority was so entrenched that ordinary citizens were willing to lay down their lives for him. Despite the resistance, Koch's days of freedom were numbered. On June 22, 2010, he was finally captured and extradited to the United States. In 2011, facing overwhelming evidence, he pleaded guilty to racketeering and conspiracy charges, admitting to running one of the most violent drug operations in the Caribbean. The following year, he was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. Even behind bars, his story hasn't faded. In 2024, his Senta 17 Mon for good behavior, resetting his release date to January 25, 2029. As of 2025, at age 56, Koch remains incarcerated in the U.S., far from Tivoli Gardens. Yet his shadow still lingers in Jamaica, where some continue to revere him as a Robin Hood figure, while others remember him as a tyrant whose lust for power cost innocent lives. Christopher Dudus. Koch's life is a paradox, part folk hero, part feared kingpin. His legacy forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth about crime bosses who blur the line between protector and predator. And as the calendar inches closer to 2029, one question grows louder. What will Jamaica look like when Dudus is finally free again? Terry Lee Flannery. In the annals of American organized crime, the story of the Black Mafia family, BMF they are. Dimitri and his younger sibling, Terry Lee Southwest T. Flannery. Born on January 10, 1970, Terry grew up in Detroit's tough streets, where he and his brother started hustling in the late 1980s. By their teenage years, they were selling $50 bags of cocaine, calling themselves the 50 Boys. What began as a small street hustle evolved into the Black Mafia family, formally established in 1985. Under Terry's guidance, the BMF transformed into one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking operations in U.S. history, generating an estimated $270 million in profits at its peak. While his brother ran operations in Atlanta, Terry oversaw the Los Angeles hub, managing supply lines directly connected to powerful Mexican cartels. His genius lay in logistics, coordinating bulk shipments, hiding product in vehicles or secret compartments, and ensuring a steady flow of narcotics into major U.S. cities. By the early 2000s, BMF employed but what made Terry unique was his low profile. Unlike Big Meech, who reveled in celebrity parties and luxury, Terry preferred to stay in the shadows. He wasn't interested in being a hip-hop icon. He was the quiet businessman focused on efficiency and discipline. This difference in approach eventually created tensions between the brothers, and by 2003, they had split their operations. Terry remained in Los Angeles while Meech commanded Atlanta's street empire. The end came in October 2005. In-Army $2 million. In 2007, Terry pleaded guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise and was sentenced to 30 years in the Federation. Unlike years later, fate gave him a second chance. In May 2020, compassionate release, citing health concerns. After nearly 15 years behind bars, he walked out of prison while his brother remained incarcerated. Then in December, Plant restoring him to society after decades of notoriety. Now in his mid-50s, Terry has chosen a different path. He is active on Instagram under the handle @Southwest263, posting about his life after prison, reconnecting with family, and even engaging with the BMF TV series on Stars, which dramatizes his and his brother's story. For a man once associated with billions in drugs and cash, this quieter life feels like an intentional contrast. Terry Lee Southwest. T. Flannery's story is one of contradictions, a kingpin who preferred the shadows, a brother caught between loyalty and rivalry, and a man who lived both the rise and fall of one of America's greatest drug empires. Today, his freedom forces us to ask, can a man who once helped build such a ruthless empire truly leave that life behind? Demetrius Flannery. When people hear the name Black Mafia family BMF, the Demetrius Big Meech Flannery. If his younger brother Terry was the strategist, the quiet operator behind the curtain, then Big Meech was the emperor who brought the empire into the spotlight. He wasn't just a drug kingpin, he was a cultural icon blurring the line between organized crime and hip-hop celebrity, leaving a legacy that still resonates in 2025. Born on June 21, 1968 in Detroit, Michigan, Demetrius Flannery came of age during the crack epidemic of the 1980s. Alongside his brother Terry, he began hustling as part of the 50 Boys, selling $50 bags of cocaine. What started as a street hustle quickly expanded into a nationwide operation. By the late 1990s, BMF had become a sophisticated drug trafficking syndicate, moving shipments directly from Mexican cartels and distributing them across major U.S. cities. At its peak, the organization reportedly employed over 500 members and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Meech's power base was in Atlanta, where he oversaw the Southeast distribution hub. But unlike Terry, who stayed in the shadows, Meech embraced the limelight. He threw place, mingled with rappers, athletes, and Hollywood stars, and projected an image of wealth and influence that made him untouchable in the eyes of many. His lavish lifestyle mansions, fleets of exotic cars, champagne-soaked nights was not just indulgence, it was strategy. Meech understood that in the modern drug game, perception was power. By the early 2000s, BMF was not only a drug empire, but also a cultural brand. Through BMF Entertainment, Young Jeezy A. The hammer fell in October 2005. In 2007, Demetrius Flannery pleaded guilty to running a continuing criminal enterprise and was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Court records revealed just how deeply he was involved, coordinating multi-kilo shipments, directing lieutenants across states, and using music as a front to legitimize profits. Even behind bars, Meech's name refused to fade. Disciplinary reports showed he was caught with cell phones and contraband evidence that his influence stretched beyond prison walls. Meanwhile, his legend only grew in popular culture. Rappers invoked his name in lyrics documentaries, examined his empire, and in 2021, Stars launched the hit TV series BMF, produced by Curtis 50 Cent Jackson, dramatizing the rise of the Flannery brothers. For fans of hip-hop and true crime, Big Meech became more than a man, he became a myth. Kenneth McGriff. In the crack-infested streets of Queens, New York during the 1980s, one name rose above the rest, feared and respected in equal measure: Kenneth Supreme McGriff. Born on September 19, 1960, McGriff grew up in South Jamaica, an area that would later become infamous as the breeding ground for some of the city's most dangerous gangs. By the mid-1980s, he had founded the Supreme Team, a crew that quickly evolved into one of the most feared drug organizations in the country. The Supreme Team wasn't just another street gang, it was an organized network with hierarchy rules and ruthless enforcement. At its peak, McGriff's operation controlled a massive portion of the Queens crack trade, raking in tens of millions of dollars annually. Unlike many rivals who ran loosely connected crews, McGriff imposed structure. He employed lieutenants, lookouts, and enforcers, creating a system that mirrored corporate management but was fueled by cocaine and bloodshed. What made McGriff particularly dangerous was his strategic use of violence. In '87 alone dropped off at least 8 homicides. Anyone who crossed McGriff faced severe consequences, and his reputation for brutality spread quickly across New York. Even hardened criminals thought twice before challenging him. McGriff's first major downfall came in 1989 when a police raid uncovered drugs, firearms, and cash. He pleaded guilty to a continuing criminal enterprise charge, and Wakey 1994, he quickly resumed his activities, but this time with even sharper cunning. The late 1990s and early 2000s brought his most infamous crimes. Federal prosecutors accused him of orchestrating multiple murders for hire to protect his empire. In 2001, he allegedly paid $50,000 to have Harlem rapper Eric E. Moneybags Smith killed in retaliation for the earlier murder of McGriff's close associate, Colbert Black Just Johnson. Smith was shot 11 times at a Queens barbecue execution style. Later that same year, McGriff ordered the killing of T.A. 7 bullets while already lying on the ground. McGriff's name was also linked to some of hip-hop's darkest moments. Authorities long suspected his involvement in the 2002 murder of Jam Master Jay from 2000, attempted murder of rapper 50 Cent, who famously survived 9 gunshots. Whether true or not, these allegations cemented McGriff as a shadowy figure lurking at the dangerous crossroads of music and crime. In 2007, his empire officially collapsed. McGriff was convicted on racketeering, drug trafficking, financial crimes, and 2 counts of murder for hire. Life in prison without the possibility of parole effects. As of 2025, Kenneth Supreme McGriff is 65 years old and remains behind bars. His story continues to fascinate because it bridges 2 worlds, the brutal crack era of Queens and the explosive rise of East Coast hip-hop. For some, he symbolizes wasted potential, a man who could have built legitimate power but instead chose blood and fear. For others, he is a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition and violence spiral out of control. Supreme's name still echoes in rap lyrics, documentaries, and debates about street legends. Whether remembered as a ruthless tyrant or a misunderstood street general. One thing is certain, Kenneth McGriff's legacy is forever carved into the violent history of New York's underworld. From Frank Matthews' mysterious disappearance to Larry Hoover's iron grip from prison and Kenneth Supreme McGriff's brutal legacy, these men shaped entire eras of fear, money, and power. Some call them ruthless criminals who poisoned communities, while others see them as complex figures born from poverty and systemic neglect. But where does the truth really lie in their crimes, or in the broken systems that created them? Drop your thoughts below. Were they masterminds or monsters? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence for more untold stories that challenge how history remembers power.